Principles of Microeconomics, Chapter 11, Monopoly and Antitrust Policy, Professor Wagner. This chapter outlines corporate mergers, how we regulate anti-competitive behavior and natural monopolies, and the Great Deregulation Experiment. Oligopoly versus competitors in the marketplace. Large corporations such as natural gas producer Kinder Morgan can bring economies of scale to the marketplace. Will that benefit consumers, or is more competition better? And that could be debated, but a lot of the times big producers of oil or natural gas will sometimes dump a lot of oil on the marketplace to drag the price down so that their competitors can in fact be washed out because they can't afford to operate any longer. And so sometimes that's a tactic used by oligopolies or monopolies to put the squeeze on smaller competitors. And so what will benefit the customers? There's more, in the short run. In the long run, more competition will be better because that would probably bring about more price stability, but that's really more of a supply side argument than anything else. Mergers and acquisitions, these are things that are spoken of a great deal in the financial world. Basically, it's mergers when two companies decide to come together as one, kind of like American Airlines and US Air from several years ago. That's still American Airlines, but in effect being run by a former US Air top management. Acquisition is one firm purchases the other. Basically, it's an outright buyout, and you may hear the term hostile takeover. This is when a larger firm just wants to take a competitor off the board, period. So they just, buy out all the stock they could possibly can and willing to pay a stupid price for the stock just to get that 51% shareholder position. And, it takes the other competitor off the board because it's being owned by a larger subsidiary. Mergers and acquisitions are measured a great deal, and it's also kind of a hint as to what's actually going on in the overall economy from a competition standpoint and from a people making money standpoint, on an individual level with respect to the firms. So you'll see that in 1999 and 2000, that was right before the big computer bubble. Mergers and acquisitions were going through the roof. A lot of that it was attributed to people setting up small companies, particularly in the tech sector, in the hopes that they get gobbled up by a larger company. For example, there are many small companies that decide to make innovative internet transmission pieces of equipment, and they went into business in the hopes that somebody like Cisco would come by and gobble them up. That's one example that comes to mind. And so you'll notice that in subsequent years, the number of mergers and acquisitions, mergers, pretty much stable. Acquisitions, okay, size of merger acquisitions submitted for review in 2012. Basically, they're just going ahead and telling you the size, of the transactions that took place. There are 3 antitrust laws that block certain mergers, even in some cases to break up larger firms into smaller ones. The Sherman Antitrust Act was actually derived from the very early 1900s with respect to oil. Standard Oil was a monopoly owned by Rockefeller. It was forced to break up into smaller companies, and so his Standard Oil was the first target of such a thing. And then subsequent laws have come into place: the Clayton Antitrust Act and the Seller Kefauver Act. Regulators have tried to measure the degree of monopoly power in industry, and so there's, the old method. Okay, the four firm concentration ratio was an earlier tool where total shares of the industry are accounted for by the largest firm, usually typically from the top 4 to 8 firms. Market share, each firm's proportion of sales in that market. So, let's say that in terms of browser activity, could easily say Chrome from Google probably is about 80% of that market, if not more, as an example. The Herfindahl-Hirshman Index, HHI, is an approach to measuring market concentration by adding the square of the market share to each firm in an industry. It's a little bit more sophisticated way of measuring, who has control of what with respect to any given marketplace. Defining a market in current times, that can be very difficult and controversial. There's been a lot of things happening. There have been two important shifts affecting how they've been defined, technology and globalization. Now we're in a situation where globalization is really being rethought, at least here in the United States, as that we've outsourced far too many important industries to foreign players who actually can control our marketplace and our access to things that we need. Needless to say, the Chinese are, such an example. We've ceded our manufacturing industry, particularly in big pharma, to allow China to produce a lot of these drugs or goods or compounds that we need to create medicine. I guarantee that's going to be rethought. Measuring degree of monopoly power the new way. And so an evolved method involves a detailed analysis of specific markets and companies. Instead of defining a market and count up total sales, estimating demand curves, supply curves, proposing a merger face, and then building a statistical model where it's a little bit more predictive. So estimate the likely outcome for consumers if the two firms are allowed to merge. So they do a little bit of data analytics to determine the actual effect. Regulating anti-competitive behavior. Antitrust laws speak for themselves. Monopoly itself is not illegal, but antitrust rules include laws against some restrictive practices, and restrictive practices is defined here. You want to know that for the test more likely. And it does not involve an outright agreement to raise price or reduce quantity produced, but that might have an effect on reducing competition. Okay, these are the type of restricted practices. And so a minimum resale maintenance price maintenance agreement, that's actually going on with oil producers right now, saying, we've got to either quit dumping oil in the marketplace, trying to put each other out of business, but rather, come acquiesce and come to some supportable rate for a barrel of oil. Exclusive dealing, where basically a dealer will only sell products from one manufacturer. Tying sales, where product is allowed to buy one product only if they buy something else along with it. And bundling is a situation where multiple products are sold as one. This happens a tremendous lot in what I'll call the telecommunications or information, technology businesses. I'm speaking mostly to like cable providers or internet providers like AT&T, Spectrum, Verizon. They want you to buy not only the internet connection, but perhaps the landline and their TV package. And this is very common practice, particularly in that industry. Regulating natural monopolies. Uh, Today, true monopolies are regulated. Natural monopoly is when average costs are declining over the range of production that satisfies market demand. It typically happens that when fixed costs are large relative to the variable cost. Regulatory choices in dealing with natural monopolies. There's actually a bit of science that goes to this. And so a natural monopoly will maximize profits, and we've seen this before. This is the condition when the marginal return equals the marginal cost. And then look into the market demand curve to see what price to change for this quantity or charge. Okay, this monopoly will produce at point A a quantity of 4 at the price of 9.3, and you can go up and down the graph to see what is going on. You have your marginal cost, your average cost, then you have your marginal return, and then you have your demand curve. If an antitrust regulator splits a company exactly in half, then each half would produce at point B. And so point B would be over here. And where the regulator might require the firm to produce where MC equals D at point C. And so we will see that point C is way down here. However, if the firm is required to produce at a quantity of 8 and sell at 3.5, the firm will suffer losses, and the likely choice will be point F, where the firm is required to produce a quantity of 6 and charge a price of 6.5, which keeps the company somewhat viable. Cost plus and versus price cap regulation. So these are two terms. Probably won't see them on the test. Cost plus is when a regulator is permitted to regulate a firm to cover its costs and make a normal level of profit. So basically, they make sure that people are not getting, scalped in terms of pricing. And price cap regulation is when regulator sets a price a firm cannot exceed over the next few years. That's happened only a few times in the United States. Usually it had to do with gas and gas consumption, but there was also rationing. That happened in the late 70s, and so people would wait in big long lines to get gas. We haven't seen anything like that here lately. The Great Deregulation Experiment, removing government controls over price and quantities. And so when supposedly regulated firms end up playing a large role instead of the regulations they will follow, as a result, they capture people usually through the promise of a job in that regulated industry once their term of government, has ended. So it's a way of effectively lobbyist. So this is how a lobby for an industry is formed, and this is how they accumulate lobbyists to go speak on their behalf in Washington. Sarbanes-Oxley is a very famous act. It's designed to keep increased confidence in financial information by public corporations, protect investors from accounting fraud. So basically, this is where a company is required to file something called a 10-K to the SEC, Security Exchange Commission, to make an accounting of their books on a public level. They have to be correct. Dodd-Frank Act is to promote financial stability in the United States by improving the transparency and accountability in a system, and end the too big to fail notion to protect the taxpayer by ending bailouts. The Great Recession of 2008 was the very thing that was the stimulus that created this act to come into place. There was a lot of companies who thought they were too big to fail. Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns are two great examples. These companies are no more. At the meantime, the government was bailing out very large firms like AIG, even federal agencies like Fannie Mae, were subject to bailouts. General Motors, Chrysler, and so very large firms had to be propped up at taxpayer expense. So hence the Dodd-Frank Act was to provide, put together to make sure that, somebody's not cooking the books. So airline deregulation, and so, this has been an evolution. So that was the first one is in 1926, permission to fly certain routes based on mail delivery needs. Then the antitrust authorities charged the Postmaster General with colluding with major airlines to monopolize Nation Airways. And then you have the Civil Aeronautics Board, and then 78 Deregulation Act took the government out of the business of determining airfares and schedules. And so airline competition really is probably one of the best examples of free market economy. But basically reduced airfares, created efficiencies. This ends chapter 11.